The convener of this 170th SLBC committee meeting, Thiru Sushil Chandra Mohanta, General Manager of IOB, Thiru P.P. Sengupta, the MD and CEO of Indian Overseas Bank, Thiru S.M.N. Swami, Regional Director of the RBI, Thiru Venkata Krishna, Chief General Manager of NABARD Office, Shri V.V.S. Karayat, the Deputy Secretary, Department of Financial Services of the Finance Ministry of India, my colleague Thiru N. Muruganandan, Additional Chief Secretary, Finance, the many senior secretaries and officers of the government who are here, the team from NABARD, and my fellow friends and bankers. Thank you all for coming and for taking the time and joining us to discuss some very important things today. As the CEO of IOB mentioned, we've just crossed 1 year in office. In some ways, it has been a big learning experience for us. Many of us are new to our jobs. Certainly, I'm new. Very new even to the system of politics, relatively speaking. And we were definitely tested, trial by fire, if you will. Within a few days of coming to office, the peak of the second wave was upon us of COVID. We struggled to get enough oxygen, find enough beds. Just when we were coming out of that, we had to do the amended budget. First time, there was so much uncertainty that we had to take a lot of guesses in putting in that budget. Just when the budget finished and we were getting ready for action, we had the historic rains. You know, if anybody argues there's no climate change, I just want to point out that we had 100-year rains twice in 5 years. So clearly, this is a consequence of some serious environmental changes. As we were recovering from that, we had the third wave upon us. And in a way that we had to adjust the schedule of the SLBC meetings. And then of course we had to go for the full budget for the second year and all the demands for grants that arose from that. At some level, it feels like we've been on a continuous kind of, high-intensity workout. But I guess at the end, the results are the important thing. Everybody can talk about the process, the intent, the philosophy. The results tell us what the real kind of impact and value is. In that sense, I'm very happy, as I'm sure you've all seen, that even in the revised estimates we presented in February, March, that the state, I should say mid-March, that the state's fiscal performance has improved significantly, and for the first time in 7 years, we brought the revenue deficit down, we brought the fiscal deficit down, and by noticeable amounts in a context at a time when most states and certainly the union government's numbers turned out to be double ours. So we came in closer to 3.5 and they were closer to 7. Now I want to make the point in this meeting, as much as in the public, that the union government has the great luxury that it only answers to itself. And nobody else puts any limits on its borrowings or its fiscal discipline. I mean, the market is eventually there, as are the rating agencies, but on a day-to-day basis, the union government answers to nobody but itself, whereas the union government actively enforces through the 293(3) provisions, actively enforces borrowing limits on the states and increasingly is aggressive about how those borrowing limits are set, which I pointed out in other forums, actually are quite arbitrary. What the central government's own CSO tells us our GSDP is, we're not allowed to borrow the limit that the central government says is the borrowing limit, or the union government says is the borrowing limit of that GSDP. Instead, they give that a haircut, saying there's some kind of netting and all that going on, as the first step, and then it gets aggressive and aggressive after that. So we are in this very difficult situation where on the one hand, the union very, very actively interferes in our daily functioning and tells us what we can and cannot do, far beyond at least the mainstream component of the Constitution, other than this one clause. I mean, we have our own FRA Act, which the Assembly is free to amend, and yet the union puts conditions on us beyond our own act. On the other hand, they tell us when we should cut and how much we should cut taxes and all that. This is not a logical or a considerate action, in my opinion. And I say this independent of politics. I'm just talking math now and numbers. But when the final account comes, you'll find that we've improved even further than we presented in the revised estimate, significantly better. And at some level, that is our job. To the extent that we have a partnership between the banking industry, starting with the Reserve Bank that does monetary policy, including all the banks that facilitate credit, that keep the market afloat, and in an emerging economy with a less than fully developed debt and credit market, then the value of these banks is even much higher. I've mentioned in previous SLBC meetings that the value of banking sector in India is much, much higher than, let's say, an advanced economy, because the market, the debt market and the unsecured credit to retail market is practically non-existent. So it is only the banks that can provide this kind of support. And in most cases, at least in my banking career, we assume that in a developing economy, if the GSDP or GDP was growing at X, that credit should grow roughly 2X to support that, because there's a lot of leverage in the system and there's not enough capital. Anyway, with that as our performance for the year, let me turn a little bit to the SLBC. As predecessors, earlier speakers before pointed out, this government under the leadership of the Chief Minister has taken very much cognizance and has given great emphasis to the value of the SLBC and its role in the economy and in our functioning. Chief Minister himself has addressed one of these meetings, and I don't think I've missed a single meeting except inadvertently when I did not know it was happening. And so now I've laid down instructions that I should be aware and given the opportunity to attend all meetings. That's how importantly we take this. The convener gave us some overview of what had happened in the previous meeting. The IOB MD spoke very insightfully both of the statistics of our state and of the activities that all of you together conduct in our state. But I was also very impressed with his very insightful and in my opinion, accurate prediction of where the world economy is and where interest rates are and where they're likely to go. Though I agree with Mr. Swamy that trying to predict Reserve Bank action is a mug's game. I think in this case we can all agree that it's only going in one direction. In fact, if I make a slight kind of tangential series of remarks from there, I've also just returned after my first kind of extended overseas trip since the pandemic. And in the course of over about 3 weeks on 2 separate trips, I was in New York, in the US and places, in Canada, in the UK, in Australia and Singapore. And it's very clear this is a global phenomenon. After years of wondering how trillions of dollars of liquidity could not, would not, and did not drive inflation, I think that dilemma no longer exists. We are in the serious throes of an inflationary cycle. That is true all over the world. It is driven partially, as the MD and CEO mentioned, by supply shocks and by unfortunate and extraneous events like the Ukraine war. But it is also driven, I think, by structural changes in the labor market that most of us did not realize had happened. So at least in the US, in most advanced economies actually, in the US, in the UK to some extent, because that's also confounded by Brexit. But in the US, in Australia, in Singapore, you have a serious problem where the snapback in demand has left the labor market very, very tight. Many people have exited the labor market. I'm saying like pilots of planes onwards, highly skilled people have exited the market and have not come back with the full intention of full-time employment. And then of course 2 years of hiatus puts all kinds of additional training requirements on bringing them back to work. So hundreds of flights are being cancelled all over the world. Hundreds of therefore meetings, activities, business processes are being disrupted. And that's just one part of the, very important, but one part of the economy. So my own view, and I had, among other meetings, I had dinner with the MIT fellow alumnus of mine, Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia. And I think it's very clear that there also, the day I met him, they had just done a rate hike for the second time this year, this calendar year, and that many more are likely to come. So I think we should expect we're going into a kind of inflation fighting cycle after probably 15 years or 13 years, 14 years since the 2008 global financial crisis for the first time. And now we have a problem. It's not just the excess liquidity that most of the banks in the world have pumped out. And just so we're not forgetting, there's at least 4 or 5 trillion or maybe more of excess liquidity from the OECD banks sloshing around in the system compared to the balance sheets of 2008. Even if you allow for the growth of the economy and of the devaluation of money through inflation, we're still looking at several $1 trillion of extra liquidity in the markets compared to what the trajectory would have been had there not been a global financial crisis, had there not been a COVID. And the double part of the whammy is that most governments have done massive fiscal stimulus as a way of offsetting or combating the effects of the pandemic. So I'm trying to think back, and I find it hard to think of any other circumstance where we had these two factors together, maybe more than 100 years ago. I certainly wasn't studying markets back in the 1920s or 30s. But in my lifetime, I am struggling to find another point in the economic kind of cycle of any country, let alone the globe, where you've had this much excess liquidity, at the same time you've had this much fiscal stimulus. And now we're paying the consequences of that. I'm not even saying it was the wrong thing to do, maybe it was the right thing to do, but now the chickens are coming home to roost. Why I say that is that both at the global level and at the national level, we must expect both interest rates to continue to rise and inflation to be an ongoing problem. This is not a problem that's going to get contained in a few weeks or a couple of months. In Tamil Nadu, as you know, we have done better than the national average by quite a bit, even by the National Statistical Office release that inflation is much lower here at about 5.4% compared to the national average of 7.8 or something. We also never had the recession in 2021, and the bounce back in 21-22 has been at least as good. So on a net-net basis, our economy has continued to grow significantly compared to the national average. In some ways, that also alleviates the inflation pressure because, we did a lot of demand stimulus when the economy was weak. And therefore, there's not that kind of big bounce back in demand at this point. But what it tells us, I think, is that we have to be very diligent about our work because we are going into some very difficult times. The headwinds are only going to get stronger. The need for coordination between us is only going to increase. And, the union secretary here, deputy secretary, highlighted some of the programs and some of the schemes that the government is doing, the union government is doing. I welcome those. I hope they are implemented successfully. Our finance secretary, who is very detail-oriented and a very diligent person, has explained all the different schemes, the rate of uptake, the places where significant attention is needed. I urge you to take his comments very seriously and pick those areas where he has pointed out significant underperformance and see whether we can improve that. I take Mr. Swami's point about scheduling these meetings in a way that facilitates RBI's greater involvement, though the original schedule was upset by COVID. You may remember it was scheduled and called off because of third wave and conditions. So we'll find a way to reset it by the next quarter and make it more convenient for the RBI. I also note NABARD's significant role in especially the underserved and the underbanked areas of the economy. They play a vital role. I'm grateful for all their intervention. I urge them to continue to ramp up. As I mentioned in the last SLBC meeting, there was a bit of a slowdown. I urge them to correct it, then I hope they'll take those comments to heart. From our perspective as a government, we are interested in a very keen and active and productive relationship between the government, the Reserve Bank, NABARD, and the commercial banks, be they nationalized or private. We think that such coordination, fiscal policy, monetary policy, execution of schemes, combined focus, matching of delivery to intent, and frequent monitoring with accurate data on a timely basis is a competitive advantage. We believe very few states do that. In fact, many countries don't do that. And so we are very keen as a government, on behalf of the Chief Minister, I will say that it is our ambition that we must have the most productive, most impactful, best functioning SLBC in India. And I think we have the team to do that. And I hope we'll achieve that in outcomes rather than just in discussions. So with that, let me apologize for being a few minutes late this morning. I just come back from overseas and there were some undue complications. But let me thank you all once again for coming here today and for attending diligently, particularly the many senior officers of the government. I know they are at least as busy as I am. I just want to leave with one thought. As we go through correcting the fisc and playing our part in providing a healthy environment, not crowding out private players in the debt market, bringing confidence to investors in the state's management of its own finances, and therefore being able to support FDI with better incentives and lever up our capital investments. I just want to tell you the scale of the transformation we are expecting to achieve in the next couple of years and why it's crucial that even our government officers need to understand that we need to play at a different level than we have played in the past. Last year, I think we did a record, if I'm not mistaken, level of capital investments, and that was about 37,000 crores. If we had been in compliance with the FRBM and our own FRA, really that number should have been closer to 60 or 65,000 crores, or maybe 70, 75,000 crores. So we basically did about half the investment we should have done. But as I say, we've improved the fiscal situation significantly, and we are on a path where we have committed in 2 years that will be near compliance. In fact, I'll tell you, our ambition is to be well in compliance, but the projected number we have set is to be near compliance. And as somebody pointed out, our projected GSDP this year is almost 24 lakh crores, and the expected growth rate for the next 2 years after that in the MTFP is roughly the same, notional of 14%. Inflation is going to be a bit high, so let's say real growth of 7-8%, easily achievable. That means in a couple of years, let's say 24-25, we're going to be a 30 lakh crore or 3 trillion rupee economy. If we are in compliance with the FRBM and FRA, as I say, at that point, our capital expenditures will be on our own balance sheet somewhere around 90,000 crores, 3%, because we'll have zero revenue deficit. 90,000 crores, we believe that with the ecosystem that has been created, partly by our predecessors, partly by us, including things like the Tamilnadu Infrastructure Fund Management Corporation and other investment vehicles, and some changes we are doing to improve the viability and the credibility and attractiveness of these vehicles as sources of funding, we can do probably 1.5% of GSDP in off-balance sheet funding. So that's another 45,000 crores. If that is the case, we are going to end up quadrupling the annual capital investment between 21-22 and 24-25. I don't think in the history of any state government that has ever been done before. We hope that we'll get huge benefits in terms of trade, investment, growth, jobs, etc. out of that. But what it also tells you is that the infrastructure, the ecosystem, the approach, the execution capability needs to be significantly greater than it is now. There's no way that with the systems and people we have now, I mean like contractors and partners, that we can execute that scale. We simply cannot. So we have to start planning for those kinds of sea changes. That means us in the cabinet, that means certainly our officers in the government, but it also means the people who facilitate into the system, all of you in the banking sector. So I'll just leave you with that thought. Thank you again for your time, and wish everybody a successful and productive meeting. Thank you.